A carpenter father trusted his only son with his entire life savings, but the son shattered that trust, leaving his father bankrupt and ruined. Will the father ever be able to reclaim his honor? Before you listen to this story, if you are a new viewer of our channel, please subscribe to our channel.
The small town of Harmony Creek, North Carolina, awoke to the calls of birds and the soft sunlight filtering through the pine needles. But Samuel Miller woke to a different sensation, the scent of wood. The rich, sweet smell of oak, the sharp, fresh aroma of pine, and the light, fruity fragrance of cherry. These scents were his life's alarm clock. His workshop was just behind the house, and when he opened his bedroom window, that fragrance would drift in with the morning breeze. For over 60 years, this scent had told him that a new day had begun, another chance to create something. Today's dawn was no exception. Samuel entered his old but impeccably clean workshop. His hand tools were arranged in neat rows along the walls. Chisels, saws, hammers, planes, each had its designated place. Years of use had worn their wooden handles smooth and shiny, as if they were extensions of his own hands. In the middle of the workshop stood his current project, a rocking chair. He was making it for the grandson of the town doctor, Jim Anderson. Samuel ran his hand over the curved leg of the chair. The wood was not yet completely smooth. He picked up his favorite hand plane, a tool that had belonged to his father. As he applied gentle pressure to the golden oak, a thin shaving of wood curled up like a ribbon. Instantly, the familiar, rich, sweet scent of oak filled the air. There was a peculiar peace in this work, a meditative quality. There was no rush here, no room for shortcuts. Wood doesn't lie. A craftsman's skill or his lack of focus all leave their mark on the wood. Several hours passed. The noise of the outside world could not penetrate Samuel's sanctuary. Here there was only the rhythmic sound of tools on wood. At one point he paused his work and looked at an old, framed photograph on the corner of his workbench. In the picture, his wife Eleanor stood smiling, with this very workshop behind her. Eleanor's eyes were so alive, they seemed as if they would speak at any moment. It had been 10 years since Eleanor passed away. The long battle with cancer had drained them of everything. Samuel's savings, even a part of his shop, had to be mortgaged to cover the medical expenses. But he never regretted it for a moment. He would have wagered everything for Eleanor. After her death, this workshop was what held him together, what kept him alive. It felt as though a piece of his love for Eleanor was embedded in every piece of furniture he made. The sign on his shop read, "Miller and Sons Fine Furniture." He had added the "and Sons" part after Jacob was born. His dream was that one day his son would carry on this legacy. As a child, Jacob used to play in this workshop, making little cars and houses from scraps of wood. Samuel had taught him how to read the grain of the wood, how to transform a simple piece of timber into an extraordinary work of art, with care and love. But as Jacob grew older, he drifted away from the world of wood. His world became one of books, computers, and the dream of the big city. Samuel never stopped him. He was proud that his son had gone to study at a prestigious university in a big city like Chicago. He believed that whatever Jacob did, he would be successful. But deep in his heart, there was a quiet ache. He wished that Jacob wouldn't forget his roots. Samuel sighed and returned to his work. He knew Jacob's world was different. It was a world of quick success, big money, and the dazzle of technology. The slow, quiet life of Harmony Creek might seem boring to him. Here, people knew each other by name and rushed to help in times of trouble. Here, success wasn't measured in dollars, but on the scales of honesty and respect. Samuel's furniture was valued because everyone knew he didn't just sell wood, he sold trust. A piece of Miller furniture meant a 3-generation guarantee. In the afternoon, Ben Carter, Samuel's childhood friend, stopped by on his way back from his hardware store. Ben was a practical and somewhat outspoken man. "Still working so hard in your old age, Sam," Ben said, perching on a stool. Samuel smiled. "As long as my hands work, I'll keep working. It keeps the soul fresh." "Any news from Jacob? Did he call?" Ben asked. "Yes, we spoke last week. He's under a lot of pressure with his studies," Samuel said, defending his son. His tone held more hidden anxiety than pride. Ben was quiet for a moment before saying, "A city boy belongs in the city, Sam. You're just holding on to false hope." Samuel didn't reply. His friend's words stung like a thorn in his chest because he knew they might be true. Before evening fell, Samuel finished his work on the chair. The perfectly polished wood gleamed in the light of the setting sun. He looked at it with a sense of satisfaction. This feeling was something no amount of money in the world could buy. The joy of creating something with his own hands. Before turning off the workshop lights and locking the door, he took one last look around. The mixed scent of oak and pine still lingered in the air. This scent was his heritage, his identity. He started walking towards the house. Tonight he would have to eat dinner alone again. Looking at the empty chair on the other side of the table, his heart felt hollow. He not only thought of Eleanor, but also of a little boy who had learned to make his first wooden toy in this workshop, holding his father's hand. Samuel looked up at the sky. It was calm and full of stars. He didn't know what the future held, but he hadn't given up hope. He believed that one day his son would return. One day he would understand that some things can't be bought with money. Things like a father's love and the sacred scent of wood.
Jacob's return was like a glittering but heavy stone thrown into the calm pond of Harmony Creek. He arrived on a Friday afternoon in a rented, sleek black sedan that was utterly out of place on the town's dusty roads. When Samuel saw the car pull up in front of his house, his heart leaped with excitement. He put down his hammer and practically ran out of the workshop door. The young man who stepped out of the car didn't seem to belong in Harmony Creek. He wore a tailored, dark blue suit, shiny Italian leather shoes, and a pricey Swiss watch that glittered in the late afternoon sun. His hair was perfectly styled, and his face bore the mark of big city hustle and confidence. But to Samuel's eyes, he was still his little Jacob, who used to play in the dirt. "Jacob!" Samuel's voice was thick with emotion. Jacob turned and smiled upon seeing his father. It was a bright smile, but Samuel felt it lacked the simple warmth it once had. "Dad," he said, stepping forward to embrace his father. Beneath the expensive fabric of the suit, Jacob's body felt firm, and he smelled of a sharp modern perfume, the exact opposite of the scent of wood. "How are you? You've gotten so thin," Samuel said, placing his hands on his son's shoulders, though Jacob didn't look thin at all. "I'm perfectly fine, Dad. Just a lot of pressure at work, you know," Jacob said as he pulled an expensive leather bag from his car. He looked around as if he had returned to a foreign place after many years. "The town hasn't changed a bit, has it?" His tone held more pity than admiration. Samuel noticed these changes in his son. The way he spoke, the way he looked at things, there was a distance in it all. Still, he was overjoyed. Come inside. I'm making your favorite, roast chicken." At the dinner table, the distance between father and son became even more apparent. Samuel eagerly shared small-town news. Ben Carter had a new saw in his shop. Mrs. Harrison's garden had won first prize at the county fair again. Jacob listened, but his attention was on his smartphone.
He kept swiping the screen, as if the world of Chicago wouldn't let him go, not even for a moment. "Dad, how's the shop doing?" Jacob suddenly asked, looking up from his phone. "It's going very well. I just finished a rocking chair for Dr. Anderson's grandson, and I've got an order for some new desks from the sheriff's office," Samuel said with pride. Jacob gave a small smile. "Desks and chairs? Dad, you're still stuck on these small things? You should have a website where people from all over the country can order. You could sell this handcrafted furniture online for thousands of dollars." Samuel paused for a moment. "I know my customers, Jacob. They like to hold my work, to feel the wood before they buy. Can you really trust a picture to buy furniture?" "Dad, times have changed," Jacob said, with a hint of impatience. "People are buying cars and even houses online now. You have to keep up with the times. You don't have any modern machinery in this workshop. You do everything by hand. You could install a CNC machine. It would increase your production tenfold." Samuel's expression hardened. "There's no place for machines in my work, Jacob. Every piece of furniture I make is crafted by my hands. It's not just wood, it has my care and love in it. A CNC machine might make a perfect object, but it has no soul." The conversation between father and son hit an invisible wall and stopped. They both realized they were speaking two different languages from two different worlds. In Jacob's eyes, his father's business was an old-fashioned, inefficient venture that was falling behind despite its potential. And in Samuel's eyes, Jacob's proposals were an insult to his life's philosophy and heritage. After dinner, Jacob pulled out a sleek laptop from his bag. "Dad, let me show you something," he said with enthusiasm. He opened the laptop and started showing various graphs and charts and statistics. "Look at this, a startup called Innovo Tech Solutions. They work with artificial intelligence. Their stock price has gone up 300% in the last 6 months. A very close friend of mine, Marcus, is a major broker for this company." Samuel looked at the colorful graphs, understanding nothing. To him, they were just meaningless scribbles. Jacob turned the laptop towards his father and said, "Dad, I'm thinking about a big opportunity, an opportunity that will change both our lives. You won't have to spend all day in this wood dust anymore. We can live a life you've never even imagined." There was a strange glint in his son's eyes, a dangerous mixture of greed and dreams. Samuel stared at Jacob's face. His happy, simple boy seemed to have become a stranger overnight. He couldn't tell if this glint was a sign of a bright future or a forecast of an approaching storm. Despite the warmth inside the house, a cold shiver ran down Samuel's spine. He realized that this night was no longer as peaceful as before. Perhaps clouds were beginning to gather in the skies of Harmony Creek.
The nights in Chicago are not as quiet as in Harmony Creek. Here, night means the glare of a million neon lights reflecting off tall buildings, a continuous symphony of car horns, and the endless clamor of people. It was at the heart of this clamor that Jacob Miller had built his new world, a world 1,000 miles away from the scent of wood in his father's workshop. Tonight, Jacob was at one of the city's most exclusive rooftop bars. Beside him sat Amelia Vance. Amelia's father was a renowned real estate magnate in the city. The dress Amelia was wearing likely cost more than Samuel's income for an entire month. She swirled a cocktail glass in her hand, listening to the clinking of ice as she gazed out at the sea of city lights. "Dad wants us to go to our house in Switzerland next month," Amelia said absently. "How about we spend the whole summer there, Jake? Reading by the lake, hiking in the Alps?" Jacob smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. Switzerland. He tried to do a quick mental calculation of the cost, and a hollow feeling immediately settled in his chest. He loved Amelia, but keeping up with her world was a constant reminder of his own limitations. When his friends talked about their new sports cars or European vacations funded by their fathers, Jacob thought about his student loans. The thought of his father's honest but meager income made him cringe with shame.
He loved and respected his father, but next to this glittering world, his father's life seemed incredibly pale and unsuccessful. Just then, a man approached their table. He was dressed in an expensive Italian suit, a confident smile on his face. It was Marcus Thorne. "Jacob, my friend, what are you doing here all alone?" Marcus was one of the most charismatic people Jacob had ever met. He spoke the language of money, the language of success. Jacob felt a mixture of envy and attraction towards him. "Jacob, hey, have a seat," Jacob said with a bit too much enthusiasm. After introducing him to Amelia, Marcus ordered the most expensive champagne for everyone. "Jacob," he said, leaning in and speaking in a near whisper, "I needed to talk to you. You know I'm always on the lookout for the next big thing, and I think I found the new digital gold mine." Marcus's eyes were gleaming. He began to talk about Innovotech Solutions. In his words, it wasn't just a company, it was the future. He used complex terms like AI-powered predictive analytics, disruptive technology, blockchain integration that made Jacob's head spin. But Jacob didn't want to look foolish. He nodded along as if he understood everything. Showing some graphs on his phone screen, Marcus said, "The people who invested at the very beginning became millionaires in 6 months. But the real game hasn't even started yet. We have some inside information. In about 6 months, this is going to shake the stock market." He took a sip of his champagne and looked directly into Jacob's eyes. "This opportunity isn't for everyone, Jacob. It's only for those who know how to take risks and dream big. For those who don't want to spend their whole lives hammering away in a small shop like their father's." The last sentence hit Jacob like an arrow. It was as if Marcus had spoken his most secret thought out loud. Back in his luxurious apartment after the party, Jacob couldn't sleep. He stood on the balcony, gazing at the city. The city had shown him dreams, but hadn't shown him a way to achieve them. He thought of his father, that honest, hard-working man who had magic in his hands, but almost nothing in his bank account. Then he thought of Amelia, of Switzerland, of the lavish life this city offered. Marcus's words echoed in his head. Know how to take risks and dream big. He began to rationalize. This isn't just greed. It's a necessity. It's a chance to free his father from that wood dust and the burden of debt. If he succeeded, he could give his father a life he had never imagined, and he could finally stand tall in front of Amelia. He became completely entangled in this web of justification. The investment no longer seemed like an unethical act or a gamble. It became the only way to earn his respect, his love, and to fulfill his duty to his father. He wasn't thinking of cheating his father. He was thinking of rescuing him. Standing on the balcony, he pulled out his phone. With a few taps, he booked a plane ticket to North Carolina. His mission had begun. He was returning to Harmony Creek, but this time he wasn't coming back empty-handed. He was returning with the tempting promise of a glittering future, a promise whose hidden darkness he was at that moment completely blind to. The illusion of Chicago had completely consumed him.
The next morning, as the light created silver lines through the dust motes in the workshop, Samuel was applying the final polish to the nearly finished rocking chair. With each stroke, the grain of the wood seemed to come alive. This world was familiar to him, under his control. Just then, Jacob appeared at the workshop door. He was wearing jeans and a simple t-shirt, but his demeanor had an impatient restlessness that was out of place in the calm environment. "Dad, I need to talk to you about something very important," Jacob said, getting straight to the point. Samuel stopped his work and turned around. "Tell me." "Not here," Jacob said, looking around as if the very walls of the workshop were listening. "Let's go to the living room." In the living room, amidst the old furniture arranged by Eleanor's hands, Jacob placed his sleek laptop on the coffee table. The machine seemed like an object from another planet. When it turned on, The warm, homely feel of the room was somehow diminished by the bright light of its screen. "Dad, about the opportunity I mentioned last night," Jacob began. He showed his father the website for Innovo Tech Solutions. The website was flashy, filled with grand promises of changing the future and photos of smiling CEOs. Then he opened the complex graphs and charts. Looked at, pointing to an upward trending graph. "This is the return on investment graph. People who invested $100,000 just a year ago are now worth nearly $500,000. This isn't a gamble, Dad. This is the power of technology, the future." Samuel stared at the screen. To him, these colorful lines were meaningless. He said, "Jacob, I don't understand any of this. To me, money means working hard with these hands, earning it honestly in exchange for a customer's smile. I can't wrap my head around how money is made just by some lines going up and down on a computer screen." "Because you're thinking in old terms, Dad," Jacob tried to explain, almost desperately. "This isn't the age of manual labor anymore. This is the era of smart work. We just have to put the money in the right place, and the money will work for itself. It's called passive income. You can retire, pursue all your hobbies. You won't have to spend your life in this wood dust anymore." Samuel didn't like that last part. "The wood dust is my life, Jacob. It's my identity. I don't want to be freed from it." At that moment, the front door opened, and Ben Carter walked in with a broad smile. "Hey, Sam, are you having your morning coffee all by yourself?" But his smile faded when he saw the tense atmosphere in the room. His eyes fell on the laptop screen. "What's this? Learning to cut wood on a computer now?" he tried to joke. Impatiently, Jacob tried to briefly explain the whole thing to Ben as well. Ben listened quietly, his expression growing increasingly stern. After hearing it all, he looked at Samuel and said in a calm but firm voice, "Sam, my grandfather used to say, if something sounds too good to be true, it usually is. This money is your life's savings. Think 10 times before you throw it into something you know nothing about." Jacob's face turned red with anger at Ben's words. "You wouldn't understand, Mr. Carter. Times have changed. You people still want to be frogs in a well." "Maybe so," Ben replied calmly, "but at least we know this well, and the water here is safe." He didn't stay any longer. Before leaving, he placed a hand on Samuel's shoulder and just said, "Be careful, my friend." As soon as Ben left, Jacob exploded. "Did you see that? Did you see, Dad? This is why this town will never progress. They're afraid of opportunity. They're afraid of change." Samuel remained silent. Ben's words had only deepened his own doubts. Jacob realized that logic wasn't working. He decided to use his final weapon, emotion. He closed the laptop and sat down next to his father. His voice softened. "Dad," he took Samuel's hands in his own, "don't you trust me? I'm your son. Would I want something bad for you? I've seen how hard life is in Chicago, how competitive it is. I just wanted to give you and me a better life, to free you from this burden of debt and all this hard work." His eyes welled up with tears. "Trust me once, just this once. Please, Dad." Samuel looked into his son's tearful eyes. He saw an ambitious young man desperately trying to prove himself. He looked at his own old, experienced hands, then back at Jacob. On one side was his lifetime of experience and ethics, and on the other, his blind love and trust for his only son. He himself no longer knew which side would win in this battle.
That night, as Harmony Creek was bathed in moonlight, Samuel Miller's living room was shrouded in pitch-black darkness. He couldn't sleep. Sitting in his old wing chair, he stared at the dead ashes in the fireplace. Ben Carter's warning hammered in his head. If something sounds too good to be true, it usually is.
His entire life's experience, his principles, everything screamed at him that this was wrong. It was a dangerous quicksand. His hands, which had built thousands of pieces of furniture, told him that nothing lasting is ever built without honesty and hard work. But then Jacob's face would flash before his eyes, his tear-filled eyes, his plea, "Trust me once, just this once." As a father, he had never faced a more difficult test. On one side was his life savings, his heritage, his security. On the other was his son's dream, his faith in his only child. His gaze fell upon a picture frame on the mantelpiece above the fireplace. In the photo, his late wife, Eleanor, was smiling. Samuel felt as if Eleanor was looking right at him. He remembered the difficult days of Eleanor's illness. He recalled the struggle to pay the hospital bills. He had wagered almost everything for his wife's treatment, but in the end, he couldn't save her. Eleanor often used to say, "Let our Jacob dream big, Sam. Let him achieve what we couldn't. Let's never be the ones to clip his wings." Samuel closed his eyes. A heavy weight settled in his chest. If he said no to Jacob now, wouldn't he be clipping his son's wings? Jacob might never trust him from the heart again. The delicate bond of affection that still held them together might be severed forever. He might save his money, but he would lose his son. This thought terrified him the most. He could rebuild his workshop, his business, but once his relationship with his son was broken, it could never be mended. The night passed, and dawn broke. As the first light entered the room through the window, Samuel had made his decision. It wasn't a business decision, it was a father's surrender. He decided to sacrifice all his logic, all his experience, all his fear at the altar of his love for his son. He slowly rose from the chair. His body felt several times heavier. He went to his bedroom and opened the iron safe hidden behind an old picture on the wall. With trembling hands, he took out the deed to his shop, the papers for his life savings, and some of Eleanor's jewelry that he could never have imagined selling. He brought everything back to the living room. He called for Jacob. Jacob came out of his room, sleepy-eyed. Samuel placed the papers on the coffee table. He made no preamble. He just said in a quiet, tired voice, "Everything you need is here." Jacob's eyes widened with incredulity and joy. He moved towards the papers, a glint of victory in his eyes. "Dad, I knew it! I knew you would understand me. You'll see, I'll change our lives." Samuel didn't look at his son's elation. He only whispered, "Don't let me down, son." In that moment, he felt he hadn't just handed over some papers. He had handed over his soul, his past and his future, everything, into his son's hands. He had placed his life's faith upon a single altar. Now, all that was left to see was if this faith would lead him to heaven or to hell.
The air-conditioned air inside the bank pricked Samuel's skin like cold needles. Everything here was the exact opposite of his workshop. Smooth marble floors, glass walls, and the low, mechanical hum of officials' voices. There was no familiar, warm scent of wood here, only the smell of paper and a faint hint of disinfectant. Samuel and Jacob sat before a loan officer. The man was dressed in a flawless suit, and his face wore a professional but emotionless smile. Spread across the coffee table in front of them was the proof of Samuel's life's work, the deed to Miller & Sons' fine furniture, tax papers, and documents of his personal savings. Jacob was the one doing all the talking. He spoke fluently, using financial terms like liquid assets,
capital investment, projected growth, as if it were his native tongue. The loan officer nodded, typed on his computer with a clattering sound, and occasionally glanced at Samuel as if he were a piece of old furniture in the room. Samuel didn't say a single word. He just signed the designated papers when required. With every signature, he felt as if he were carving away pieces of his own existence. His hands, which could shape hard oak into art, trembled slightly as they held the pen. He felt he wasn't signing a contract, but rather a deed to hand over his own fate into the hands of another. The most difficult moment came when he had to hand over Eleanor's jewelry box to be mortgaged. As the box opened, a faint scent of lavender, the scent Eleanor used to wear, wafted out. Inside, resting on red velvet, were a thin gold necklace and a pair of pearl earrings. They might not have been incredibly valuable, but they held the most beautiful memories of Samuel's life. The officer picked up the jewelry with a kind of dispassionate curiosity, the way a scientist examines a specimen. A knot twisted in Samuel's stomach. Jacob, on the other hand, had only a glint of excitement in his eyes. To him, all of this was just a series of necessary steps to reach his desired goal. He couldn't see the pain inside his father, or perhaps he didn't want to. His entire focus was on the million-dollar dream of the future. An hour later, they walked out of the bank. In Jacob's hand was a check for an amount Samuel had never seen all at once in his life. Jacob was on the verge of jumping with joy. "We did it, Dad! We did it! This is just the beginning. You'll see, within 6 months, I'll pay off this loan and get your jewelry back." Samuel gave no reply. He just stared blankly at the city street. He felt as if he had drifted far away from the world he knew. That afternoon, Jacob prepared to catch his flight to Chicago. His bags were packed, his eyes full of big dreams, and in his hand was his father's life savings. Before leaving, he hugged his father. "Don't worry, Dad, everything will be okay." Samuel bade his son farewell and then returned to his now empty living room. Gazing at Eleanor's picture, he whispered, "Did I do the right thing, Eleanor? Was I right to trust our son?" The silence of the room offered no answer. The scent of wood drifted in from the workshop, but even that familiar smell could not comfort him today. He knew he had just made the biggest gamble of his life. Now, all he could do was wait for the results.
The weeks following Jacob's departure were long and anxious for Samuel. He worked in his workshop every day, but his mind was always near the phone. He would run his hands over the wood, but his ears were alert for a ringtone. Each day was an endless wait. Then, after nearly 3 weeks, the phone rang one evening. Samuel's heart leapt into his throat as he saw Jacob's name flash on the screen. "Hello?" he said, his voice trembling. Jacob's elated voice came through the phone. "Dad, great news! Didn't I tell you? Didn't I tell you everything would be all right?" Jacob spoke in a torrent. He explained that Innovotech had developed a groundbreaking software for the healthcare sector, causing their stock prices to soar like a rocket. He used terms like market volatility, quarterly growth, and stock options, none of which made any sense to Samuel. But one thing he understood clearly, the sound of success in his son's voice. "And you know the best part, Dad?" Jacob nearly shouted. "I've sent the first month's profit to your account. It's not a lot, but this is just the beginning." As soon as he hung up, Samuel ran to the only ATM booth in town. When he inserted his card with trembling hands and checked the balance, his eyes filled with tears. Several $1,000s had indeed been deposited into his account. The amount seemed unbelievable to him. So much money, without any physical labor. He thought that perhaps Jacob was right after all. Perhaps the times really had changed. That night, he invited Ben Carter over for dinner. With a proud face, he held out his account statement in front of Ben. "See, Ben, my boy did it. You were worried for nothing." Ben looked at the paper, the skeptical frown still etched on his forehead. He only said,
The beginning seems good. I hope the end is good too." Samuel didn't like Ben's cool reaction, but he was so blinded by his son's success that he dismissed his friend's warning as unnecessary jealousy. Meanwhile, in Chicago, Jacob stood on the balcony of a luxurious apartment, a glass of expensive champagne in his hand. The city lights glittered before him. The monthly rent for this apartment was equal to several months of Samuel's shop income. He had only invested a small fraction of his father's money into the dubious company called Innovotech. The bulk of the money was being spent on upgrading his own lifestyle. He had gifted Amelia a diamond necklace, was throwing parties for friends at expensive restaurants, and acting as if he were already a successful investor. The money he had sent his father wasn't profit. It was a portion of the principal capital. This was part of his plan, to initially send his father small amounts to gain his trust, so that if any questions arose in the future, his father would believe him without hesitation. The next 2 or 3 months passed this way. Every month Jacob would call his father with new stories of success and send some money to his account. Samuel became a complete believer that his son possessed a magic lamp. He started thinking about replacing his old pickup truck and even made a list of new tools for the workshop. He had taken the biggest risk of his life, and now it felt like it had been the best decision of his life. But he had no inkling of the devastating winter that was approaching under the guise of this phony spring. One day, a letter arrived in the mailbox from the bank. It was a standard letter, a reminder of the date for the first loan installment. Samuel smiled when he saw the letter. He put it in a drawer and thought to himself, "My Jacob will pay off the entire loan in just a few months." He didn't know that this letter was the first warning sign of the coming storm.
The 4th month began with an unsettling silence. For the past 3 months, Jacob's call, his voice brimming with excitement, would arrive within the first week of the month. But this time, the first week rolled into the second with no word. Even the sound of Samuel's hammer in the workshop seemed to have lost its bright ring. He tried to reassure himself that Jacob was probably busy with a big project. Important people have important business. But on the 10th day of the month, when no money was deposited into his account, Samuel's heart skipped a beat for the first time. He couldn't wait any longer. With trembling fingers, he dialed Jacob's number. After a few rings, Jacob answered, but the previous elation in his voice was gone, replaced by a kind of suppressed tension and fatigue. "Dad, hey, I was just about to call you. I've been really busy with the market." Samuel hesitated before asking, "Is everything all right, son?" Yes, absolutely," Jacob replied, a bit too quickly. "Actually, the market is a bit down right now. It's a very normal thing. They call it a market correction. You get these little bumps before a big profit. I'm holding on to our shares. If I can sell at the right time, the profit will double. You don't worry about a thing." Samuel understood nothing of finance. All he understood was that no money was coming this month. He felt a pang of disappointment, but reassured his son. "All right, son, you do what you think is best." But a week later, the letter that arrived in the mailbox escalated his worry in an instant. This was no ordinary letter from the bank. Stamped across the envelope in red ink were the words, "Notice of late payment." Samuel's hands and feet went cold. He opened the letter to find the bank informing him that the due date for his first loan installment had passed and that he would have to pay a penalty. He immediately called Jacob again, his voice now laced with clear anxiety. "Jacob, a letter came from the bank. They're saying the loan payment wasn't made." There was a moment of complete silence on the other end of the line. Then Jacob responded, almost angrily, "Dad, that must be some kind of system error. I sent the check. You know how these banks are nowadays. Don't you worry at all. I'll talk to them tomorrow and sort everything out. Why are you stressing out over such a small thing?" "But—" Samuel started to say something.
"Dad, please," Jacob cut him off. "I'm working on a huge deal. Don't you trust me?" That one question silenced Samuel. Doubting his son felt like a sin to him. He hung up the phone, but the thorn of unease in his chest did not go away. He wanted to believe Jacob, but the red letters from the bank kept flashing before his eyes. He couldn't sleep that night. He sat in the dim light of the living room, holding the letter. He felt as though a dark shadow was beginning to fall over his beautiful dream, the dream that had given him a new life for the past 3 months. Was it about to shatter? He remembered Ben Carter's words. If something sounds too good to be true, the phrase now rang in his ears like an ominous bell.
The winter morning was quiet as ever, but Samuel's inner world was a raging storm. The scent of wood in the workshop could no longer calm his mind. He was trying to carve a design onto the leg of a new chair, but his hands were trembling. His eyes kept darting towards the road, waiting for the postman. Jacob's calls were rare now. When he did call, there was a hurried tone in his voice that made the weight on Samuel's chest even heavier. Around noon, as he was desperately trying to focus on his work, the bell on the shop door chimed, but it wasn't a customer. It was the town's bank manager, Mr. Henderson. Samuel had known the man, now in his 50s, for nearly 30 years. He was dressed in an impeccable suit, but his face was unusually grim. "Samuel, how are you?" Mr. Henderson asked politely, but his gaze was cold. "I'm fine, Robert. Come in. What brings you here?" Samuel said, putting down his chisel. His heart began to pound with an unknown dread. The bank manager never came to the shop himself. "I didn't come to waste your time, Samuel," Mr. Henderson said, pulling a paper from a file and placing it on the counter. "I just wanted to inform you of this in person. 2 installments on the loan taken out in your shop's name are overdue. This is the 3rd month's notice." Samuel felt the ground slipping from beneath his feet. He picked up the paper with a trembling hand. The words, written in red ink, swam before his eyes. 2 installments, but that can't be right. Jacob, he's handling everything. A flicker of sympathy crossed Mr. Henderson's face. "Look, Samuel, I respect you. You're an honest businessman in this town. That's why I've come to speak to you directly. We've called Jacob several times and sent letters. Each time he said he was taking care of it, but nothing has been done. If 1 more installment is missed, the bank will be forced to take action as per the rules. Your shop, it could go up for auction." The last words struck Samuel's head like the blow of a hammer. His lifelong dream, his father's legacy, all of it to be auctioned off. For his own son's mistake? He couldn't stand any longer. He collapsed onto a stool. Mr. Henderson left silently without another word. Just at that moment, Ben Carter walked into the shop. Seeing Samuel's pale, devastated face and the red-inked notice on the counter, he understood everything. "Samuel," Ben called out, his voice filled with concern. In a broken voice, Samuel said, "It's all over, Ben. Everything I have is gone." Ben placed a hand on his shoulder. "Nothing is over yet. Call Jacob right now. Ask him where the money went. No more excuses. You need to hear the truth now." Ben's words seemed to give Samuel a sliver of strength. He took the phone out of his pocket. No more hesitation, no more soft tones. His trembling fingers dialed Jacob's number. After 2 rings, Jacob answered. "Hello, Dad, I'm a bit busy." "Where is your money, Jacob?" Samuel thundered. His voice was so sharp that Jacob was startled on the other end. "The bank manager was here. He said the shop is going up for auction. Where is the profit from your investment?" There was a moment of pin-drop silence on the other end. Then Jacob's panicked voice came through. "Dad, calm down. There must be some misunderstanding. I sent the money. Maybe there's a system problem." "Don't you lie to me," Samuel screamed. "Not one more lie. I believed all your graphs, all your charts. I gave you my life savings. And this is how you repay me? Trust me, Dad, I'll fix everything." Jacob's voice was now desperate. "There's been a sudden big problem in the market. All our money is temporarily tied up. Just give me a few more days. I promise I'll bring all the money back." Samuel could hear the hollow echo in his son's voice. He didn't say another word. He just said, "I have nothing more to say." Then he hung up. In the silence of the workshop, only the sound of Samuel's heavy breathing could be heard. He stared at the notice on the counter. The red ink seemed to burn in his eyes. He realized that Jacob's few more days meant an eternity. He couldn't wait.
Staring at that computer screen in Ben's office, Samuel's inner world seemed to freeze in an instant. His grief slowly transformed into a cold, hard resolve. He wasn't just tormented by the fear of losing his shop, his life's work. His pain ran much deeper. How could his son, his own flesh and blood, lose himself in such a world of lies? This question hurt him more than the loss of any money. Returning home, he didn't hesitate. In a corner of his wardrobe, some money left over from his wife's treatment was kept in an old tin box. He took it out as his last resort. The very next morning, he set off for Chicago on the first bus. As the boundaries of his small, quiet town faded behind him, Samuel felt as though he was entering an unknown, dark world. After a long 12-hour bus journey, night had fallen by the time he reached Chicago. The city's skyscrapers, flashing neon lights, and the ceaseless stream of cars seemed to swallow him whole. This city was the complete opposite of the world he knew, vast, mechanical, and soulless. He found the address of the luxurious apartment Jacob had given him. When the taxi dropped him off in front of the gleaming building, Samuel froze for a moment. He thought he had come to the wrong place. This massive structure of glass and steel had no resemblance to his simple world of woodwork. When he entered, a uniformed doorman stopped him in the marble lobby. He frowned, looking at Samuel's simple clothes and his tired, devastated face. "Who are you looking for?" His voice was laced with clear suspicion. "I've come to see Jacob Miller. He lives in apartment 36B. Samuel said calmly. The doorman checked something on his computer and replied in a cold tone. "No one by that name lives here anymore. Mr. Miller was asked to vacate the flat a week ago for non-payment of rent." The words struck Samuel like poisoned arrows. So Jacob's luxurious life was also a lie? He couldn't even pay the rent for this flat? Dejected, he walked out. Where would he go now? Where would he find Jacob in this enormous city? He suddenly remembered Amelia. Jacob used to talk about her often, but he didn't know her full name or address. He only knew that Jacob had met her at the University of Chicago. As a last resort, he headed towards the university campus. He had no idea whom to ask on the vast campus. He sat in a cafe in front of the business school, staring blankly at the pictures of graduating students, hanging on the wall. Suddenly, he saw Jacob in one of the photos. In a corner of the picture was the smiling face of Marcus Thorne. As he was staring at the picture, a young student came and stood beside him. "Are you looking for someone, sir?" Samuel pointed a trembling finger at Marcus's picture and said he knew this man. "He's a friend of my son." The student looked at Marcus's picture and sneered. "Marcus Thorne. Everyone knows him. He was the biggest swindler in the university. The police arrested him last month in another fraud case." This information hit Samuel like a thunderbolt. So Jacob wasn't just foolish. He had fallen prey to a professional con artist. He realized his son was likely a victim of this conspiracy. But where was Jacob? Suddenly it occurred to him that Jacob might be hiding in one of his old haunts. He remembered Jacob once mentioning staying with a friend in an old motel on the outskirts of the city. This was from his very early days in Chicago. It was a faint hope, but for Samuel it was the only path he had left.
He opened the city map and started looking for the address of that old, almost forgotten motel. He was no longer searching for the Jacob behind the mask. He was now...
The motel on the outskirts of the city was named the Starlight Inn. But despite the light in its name, the place was filled with darkness and despair. The S on the neon sign of the highway-side motel wasn't lit, making it look like the Tarlight Inn. The air was thick with the smell of diesel and the distant sound of truck horns. When Samuel got off the bus and stood in front of the motel, he felt as if he had walked onto the set of a crime scene. The man sitting behind the counter looked as faded and tired as his surroundings. He looked at Samuel as if his presence was an unwelcome annoyance. Samuel took out an old folded photograph of Jacob from his wallet. In the picture, Jacob was smiling, his eyes full of dreams and confidence. "Have you seen this boy?" Samuel asked, holding the picture out to the man. The man glanced at the picture and said indifferently, "What's his name?" "Jacob. Jacob Miller." Hearing the name, the man seemed to stir slightly. He checked something on his computer and said, "Yeah, he's here. Room 107. In the back, corner room. 2 weeks behind on rent." His voice was thick with clear disdain. Samuel's heart felt like it would tear out of his chest. Jacob was here. His son was here, hiding, defeated, and likely penniless. He started down the corridor. The paint on the doors was peeling. The carpet was torn in places, and the air held a damp, musty smell. With every step, a hammer pounded inside his chest. What would he say to Jacob? Would he scream? Would he take him back? Or would he turn away in disgust? He had no answer to any of these questions. He stopped in front of door 107. There was no nameplate, only the faded number barely clinging on. He closed his eyes for a moment, praying to God for strength. Then, raising his trembling hand, he knocked on the door. Once, twice. There was no answer from inside. He knocked again, a little louder. This time, a broken, annoyed voice drifted from within. "Go away! I don't have any money!" He knew that voice, but it had no life in it. It was his son's voice, but the soul within it seemed dead. Samuel gathered all his strength and said in a calm but firm voice, "Jacob, it's me." An abrupt silence fell inside. It felt as if time had stopped. A few moments later, there was the faint click of a lock. The door opened a crack. The face that peeked through the gap was one Samuel almost didn't recognize. It was Jacob, but a mere shadow of him. His hair was disheveled. He had several days' worth of stubble on his face. His eyes were sunken, and he was enveloped in an aura of exhaustion and shame. He was as startled to see his father as if he had seen a ghost. His lips trembled, but no sound came out. Through the crack in the door, Samuel could see the state of the room. Small, dark. The bedsheets were in a mess, and the floor was littered with empty fast food containers and piles of clothes. So this was his son's Chicago dream, this filthy, depressing room. Jacob couldn't meet his father's eyes any longer. The wall of lies he had so carefully constructed came crashing down. He didn't have the strength to stand before his father's tired, sad eyes. He let out a choked cry of "Dad!" and collapsed to the floor, right at the doorway. His body shook violently. He buried his face in his hands and began to sob like a child. There was no acting in his tears. It was only pure remorse, shame, and the pain of defeat. Through his sobs, he mumbled incoherently, "I'm sorry, Dad. I ruined everything, everything. Marcus cheated me. The money is gone. I couldn't face you. I'm a loser, Dad. A failure."
Samuel walked into the room. He looked at his son, his face as emotionless as stone. He didn't scream, didn't ask any questions. He was simply witnessing the complete downfall of his son. The son he had raised, teaching the value of honesty and hard work, was now crying in the ruins of his own lies. This sight was the greatest heartbreak of Samuel's life. More painful than his shop, his money, his honor, this scene was the most agonizing. He didn't kneel beside his son. He didn't embrace him. He just stood before him like a devastated judge. Finally, his silence broke, and a single question emerged, a question heavier than a mountain. Why, Jacob? His voice was quiet, but hidden behind that quiet tone was the cry of a father's shattered heart.
Samuel didn't know how long he stood in that damp, dark motel room in front of Jacob. His son's cries and disjointed apologies reached his ears, but the words failed to register. His inner world was so completely shattered that nothing from the outside could touch him anymore. He didn't help Jacob up, nor did he offer any words of comfort. No more questions left his lips. Why? How? For what? The answers to these questions were now meaningless. What had happened had happened. The dream was dead. Finally, he turned around in silence. His back was to Jacob, who was still sobbing on the floor. Samuel didn't look back, not even once. He walked out of the room, gently pulling the door to, but not closing it. Then, with slow, heavy steps, he walked down the filthy corridor and out of the motel. He left Jacob alone, amidst the rubble of his shattered dreams. The entire bus ride home was a long, silent journey. Samuel's gaze was fixed out the window, but he saw neither the dazzling lights of Chicago nor the serene green of the countryside. His mind was numb, devoid of feeling. Anger, sorrow, and despair had merged into a cold stone in his chest. It felt as though he was returning from the funeral of his own life. By the time the bus dropped him in Harmony Creek, afternoon was bleeding into evening. His own town felt alien to him, or perhaps he had become the alien. He walked past a shop, Miller and Sons Fine Furniture. The word Sons twisted in his gut like a sharp knife. The bank's final notice, taped to the glass door, was a public declaration of his failure. Neighbors looked at him. Their eyes held a mix of pity, curiosity, and perhaps a secret condemnation. Samuel felt the lifelong respect he had earned turn to dust on the street. He went straight to Ben Carter's store. Ben saw him and asked no questions. Samuel's silent, ravaged face was answer enough. Ben just placed a hand on his shoulder and motioned for him to sit. "I called the bank," Ben said quietly. "They're not willing to negotiate. The auction date is set, next Friday." Friday. Only 3 days away. Samuel received the news with complete detachment, as if Ben were speaking of another man's life. Nothing mattered to him anymore. That night, Samuel unlocked his workshop for the last time. As he stepped inside, the familiar sweet scent of wood filled his nostrils. The very scent that had been his greatest comfort now felt as cold as death. He turned on the light. The half-finished furniture that had come to life under his touch, the tools from his father's era hanging on the walls, and the sawdust floating in the air, it was all a living museum. The museum of his life. He ran a hand over an unfinished rocking cradle. He had started it for his future grandchildren. A sharp pain twisted inside him. He looked at the wall where a framed picture hung, a young Samuel learning the craft from his father. Next to it, another picture, Eleanor bringing him coffee, an indelible smile on her face. And beside that, a little Jacob playing with scraps of wood. His entire life flashed before his eyes. This workshop wasn't just a building of brick and wood, it was his dream, his legacy, his identity. And today, it was all over. He didn't try to pack his tools. He felt no urge to save anything. He simply stood in the middle of the workshop. This place was the embodiment of all his life's work, all his honesty and labor. He took a silent farewell. Walking out of the workshop, he locked the door. Then he left the key in the lock. It was a symbol of his surrender. He no longer had any right to this place. Samuel vanished into the darkness of the night. Behind him remained his shuttered workshop, a tomb for a father's broken dream. He didn't know where he was going or what he would do.
To Jacob, his father's silent departure was more agonizing than 1,000 slaps. If Samuel had screamed, hit him, or even turned him over to the police, Jacob might have felt slightly less guilty. But his father's cold, broken silence was a final verdict, a declaration that Jacob was such a profound disappointment that he was no longer worth even a single word. After Samuel left without closing the door, Jacob had no idea how long he sat on that filthy floor. His tears had dried up, but the fire of shame and remorse burned fiercely within him. He understood for the first time, in the truest sense, that he hadn't just lost money. He had lost the only anchor in his life, his father. Hours later, as the pale morning light filtered through the curtains, Jacob stirred. His body ached, but the emptiness inside was a far greater pain. A faint hope flickered in his mind. Amelia. Perhaps Amelia would understand. Perhaps her love would give him the strength to rise from these ruins. He plugged his nearly dead phone in to charge and called Amelia. The phone rang and rang, unanswered. He tried again. This time the call was rejected. He sent a text message. "Amelia, please, I desperately need to talk to you. I'm in trouble." Hours passed. There was no reply. Around noon, the motel manager began to pound on the door. "Pay the rent, Miller, or get out now." Jacob had only a few dollars in his pocket. He pleaded with the manager, begging for just one more day. But the man's eyes held no mercy. Within half an hour, Jacob was evicted with his few belongings in tow. On his shoulder was a backpack, and in his hand was his MBA degree certificate, which now felt like a meaningless piece of paper. He was now on the streets of Chicago. The tall buildings that were once symbols of success to him now seemed to laugh at him mockingly. He wandered the city streets, just as his father had, but Jacob had a purpose. Jacob was completely aimless. As a last resort, he headed towards Amelia's house. It was located in one of the city's most exclusive neighborhoods. Standing in front of the massive gates, his own pathetic state felt even more pronounced. He pressed the button on the intercom. After a long pause, Amelia's father's grave voice came through. "Who is it?" "It's Jacob. Can I please speak to Amelia?"
The distance from Chicago to Harmony Creek was several hundred miles, but for Jacob, the journey felt endless. He didn't have enough money for the bus fare. He sold his expensive smartphone, the last relic of his Chicago life, to a passerby for a pittance. With that money, he bought a bus ticket that would drop him off at a junction near his town. He would have to walk the rest of the way. Through the bus window, he watched the vast American landscape roll by. Each mile stripped him further of the arrogance of his old life and pushed him toward a harsh reality. He was no longer Jacob Miller, the promising finance graduate from Chicago. He was just a defeated soul who had lost everything by falling into a trap of his own making. When he reached the outskirts of Harmony Creek in the late afternoon, he was utterly wrecked, physically and mentally. The town was as quiet as ever, but in Jacob's eyes, everything had changed. The very air he had once considered a cage, he now desperately sought for a breath of freedom. He avoided the main road, choosing to walk through the back alleys. He didn't want anyone to see him. But in a small town, nothing stays hidden. From a distance, he saw a large auction banner hanging in front of his father's shop. The words struck his chest like a hammer blow. He was the cause of this destruction. A few old acquaintances spotted him. There was no surprise in their eyes, just a mixture of pity, contempt, and scorn. Their whispers, heavier than the wind, stung Jacob's ears. He lowered his head and walked faster. He didn't go to his father's house. With what face could he stand at that door? He had no right to ask for shelter from the father he had ruined. He rented a room at the Creekside Inn, the town's cheapest, most derelict motel. This room was even more dilapidated than the one in Chicago, but this time it was his own choice, the first step of his penance. The next morning, Jacob began his search for work, but the news had already spread like wildfire. Samuel Miller's son had bankrupted his father. No one would hire him. His MBA degree was nothing more than a laughingstock here. The shopkeepers who had once blessed him with a pat on the head now turned their faces away. After days of fruitless searching, he finally found a job. It was as a day laborer on a construction site outside of town. No questions were asked, only a simple instruction. Be here at 7 a.m., $8 an hour. The next morning, Jacob reported for work. His soft, smooth hands, accustomed only to keyboards and pens, held heavy bricks, bags of cement, and iron rods for the first time. By the end of the first day, his hands were covered in blisters, and his body ached to the point of breaking. He felt the difference between an air-conditioned Chicago office and the burning Harmony Creek sun in every cell of his body. At the end of the day, when he received his wages, he held only a few notes in his hand. But this money was his first honest earning, gained through sweat and physical labor. He dragged his filthy, exhausted body back to the motel room. A cheap sandwich was his dinner. He had no comfortable bed, no expensive car, no Amelia's love. But that night, for the first time in many months, Jacob fell into a deep, sound sleep. Because for the first time, he wasn't running. He was facing his mistakes and had begun the arduous journey of his atonement. Every brick he carried was the weight of his sin, every drop of sweat a tear.
Samuel Miller was now a shadow of his former self. After his shop, workshop, and home were all auctioned off, he had moved into a dilapidated, rented room on the edge of town. The room was small, damp, and almost bare of furniture. Nothing he had made with his own hands was with him anymore. He spent most of his days inside, his connection to the outside world almost completely severed. It was as if the words of his life had run out. Ben Carter would often bring him food. He was Samuel's only link to the world. One evening, Ben came and sat beside Samuel. After a long silence, he said hesitantly, "Sam, there's something—" Jacob is back in town. There was no change in Samuel's expressionless face. He remained as still as a stone. Ben continued, "He's at the Creekside Inn, and he's working as a day laborer at that new construction site outside of town." This piece of information was like the first crack in the stone. Samuel's fist clenched involuntarily. His son, his MBA-educated son, was working as a day laborer? The news seemed unbelievable, but looking into Ben's eyes, he knew it was true. After Ben left, the news churned within Samuel. He couldn't sleep. 2 images flashed before his eyes again and again. On one side, Jacob in a suit and tie, a fancy watch on his wrist. And on the other, Jacob, covered in dust and grime, engaged in manual labor.
He could find no connection between the two images. A few days later, one afternoon, Samuel left his room. His feet, as if of their own accord, led him toward the construction site. He stood behind a large tree across the street, so no one could see him. The site was noisy. The clang of hammers and the scream of saws and the shouts of workers made it deafening. Amid this chaos, he found him. Jacob. He was wearing an old, torn t-shirt and jeans. His golden hair was gray with dust. His face was tanned and weathered by the sun. He was intently lifting a heavy bag of cement onto his shoulder. His body was trembling, his legs unsteady, but he didn't give up. After placing the bag in its designated spot, he panted heavily, the sweat on his forehead mixing with the dirt to form streaks of mud. Samuel stared, transfixed. He didn't know this young man. His luxurious, arrogant son was gone. The person standing before him was a complete stranger. Tired, defeated, yet in every action there was a fierce, desperate effort. This wasn't a struggle for success. It was a fight for survival, a fight for penance. Suddenly, as if prompted by a sixth sense, Jacob looked up. His eyes fell on the figure standing behind the tree across the street. For a moment, all the noise of the sight seemed to cease. Father and son's eyes met. A busy road separated them, but at that moment, it felt as though they were standing on opposite sides of a shattered mirror. In Jacob's eyes, there was intense shame, fear, and a drop of pitiable pleading. And in Samuel's eyes, there was a bottomless void, an ocean of pain that words could not express. No word was spoken, not even a gesture was made. After a few moments that felt as long as an eternity of looking at each other, Samuel turned around. He began to walk back slowly the way he had come. He did not look back, not even once. Jacob stared at the path his father had taken. His heart was pounding. His father hadn't forgiven him, nor had he accepted him, but he had come. He had seen him. This silent exchange of glances was an acknowledgement of his existence, an acknowledgement of his suffering. For Samuel, it was the first blow against the deep, frozen ice of his grief. And for Jacob, it was the first pinprick of light.
Several weeks had passed since the silent exchange of glances at the construction site. Jacob continued to go to work every day, just as before. His body had now grown accustomed to the heavy labor. The blisters on his hands had hardened into calluses. He no longer carried bags of cement with faltering steps, but worked with a kind of mechanical resolve. Every day was a repetition of the last: hard labor, meager wages, and lonely, silent nights at the motel. He kept track of every penny he earned. Day after day, he ate only the cheapest food to save as much as he could. This saving wasn't to pay off a large debt. It was a symbolic attempt at penance. To him, every dollar was a concentrated form of his remorse. One Saturday evening, after receiving his first full month's wages, Jacob counted the money he had saved in his small tin box. The amount was laughably small, but to him, its value was immense. He knew it was time. He stood before the motel's only broken mirror. He cleaned himself up as best he could, although he had no decent clothes to wear. He put on an old but clean t-shirt and set out. His destination was the edge of town, where his father now lived. The walk to Samuel's rented room was the longest journey of Jacob's life. With every step, his heart pounded. What would he say? Could any words possibly convey the gravity of his actions? He rehearsed his apology 1,000 times in his mind, but every version felt hollow and inadequate. Finally, he stood before the dilapidated door. The paint was peeling from the worn wood. He hesitated, his hand seeming to freeze in place. After a few moments of intense internal struggle, he knocked on the door. The sound was unnaturally loud in the evening quiet. The door opened. Samuel stood there. There was no surprise in his eyes, only a profound weariness. He saw his son, thin, tired, but with a new clarity in his eyes that never had been there before. Samuel's face was as impassive as stone. He didn't invite Jacob in, he simply stood there, waiting. Jacob didn't offer any prelude. He didn't try to make any excuses. He looked directly into his father's eyes. In his hand was an old, folded envelope containing all his savings from the past few weeks. With a trembling hand, he held out the envelope towards his father. "Dad," his throat was dry. "I know this is nothing. Compared to the damage I've caused, this is less than dust. I just want to say that I'm sorry. I am repentant for my mistakes." He paused for a moment, taking a breath. "I'm not asking for anything from you. Not forgiveness, not shelter. I just want you to know that I've started trying to pay my debt. Every day, little by little." Samuel looked at the envelope, then at Jacob's calloused, dirty hands. He didn't take the envelope. His stern expression didn't change, but deep in his eyes, the first crack in the icy armor of his grief, he only said in a quiet, low voice, "Take care of yourself." Then he slowly closed the door. Jacob stood alone outside the closed door. He hadn't been directly rejected, but he hadn't been accepted either. He gently placed the envelope on the doorstep, in front of the threshold. Then he turned. As he walked away, he felt no relief, but there was a small, fragile sense of purpose. He had taken the hardest, first step. Inside, Samuel leaned against the door for a moment. Then he opened it and picked up the envelope from the threshold. Back inside the room, he opened it. Inside were a few old folded notes, earned through hard labor. As he stared at the notes, for the first time in many months, a single tear rolled down Samuel Miller's cheek.
It was as if the clock of Samuel Miller's life had stopped. The envelope of money Jacob had left lay untouched in a corner of his table. He hadn't even touched it. Money could not fill his emptiness. His hands itched for the touch of wood. His senses searched for the scent of varnish, and his ears longed for the rhythmic sound of the chisel and hammer. Without work, Samuel Miller was like a fish out of water. He was slowly wasting away. Ben Carter grew alarmed watching his friend's condition. One evening, bringing dinner for Samuel, he said directly, "Sam, don't destroy yourself like this. You are a craftsman. You can't live without work." With a vacant stare, Samuel said, "What work will I do, Ben? I have no tools, no workshop. Everything I had is gone." Ben was silent for a moment. Then he said, "My old garage is just sitting empty. It's been gathering junk for years. It's not as big as your workshop, but it's a roof over your head, and I have some old tools too. You can use them if you want." For the first time, a faint glimmer of light appeared in Samuel's eyes. A workshop? A place to work? Ben didn't let the opportunity slip. "A few of the pews at the old church are broken. Father John is very worried. They don't have the money to buy new ones. He was looking for someone who could repair them for a low cost." Hearing the mention of work, the craftsman within Samuel seemed to stir. But then his face clouded over with darkness again. "I can't do the heavy work alone at my age, Ben." Ben had been waiting for this exact moment. He said cautiously, "You'll need a helper, someone strong who can carry wood, clean the tools. Jacob is working as a day laborer now. He's capable of hard labor." The moment he heard the name, Samuel's face hardened again. To work with the boy who had destroyed everything? Impossible. But that night, he dreamed he was working in his old workshop. His hands were cutting and smoothing wood with perfect rhythm. When he woke up, he knew Ben was right. Without work, he would die. The next afternoon, Samuel went to the construction site again. This time, he didn't hide behind a tree. He went to the site foreman and asked for Jacob. At the end of the day, as a sweaty and exhausted Jacob was leaving the site, he saw his father standing by the side of the road. His heart leaped into his throat. He approached him with trepidation. Samuel's voice was low and emotionless, as if he were speaking to a stranger. "I have a job. Some church pews need repairing. I need a helper. Can you work for 3 hours every evening after your shift?" Jacob stared at his father, stunned. Was he hearing correctly? Samuel continued, $8 an hour, the same as you're getting now. The job is just to carry wood and follow my instructions, nothing more. There was no father-son relationship here, no hint of forgiveness or sympathy. It was a job offer, dry, conditional, and strict. Jacob's eyes filled with tears, but he held them back. Only one word escaped his trembling throat. "I can." The next evening, Samuel took Jacob to Ben's abandoned garage. The place was dark, damp, and filled with cobwebs. In a corner lay some old, rusted tools. The air was heavy and musty. This was their new workshop. Father and son stood in the middle of the garage surrounded by piles of junk and broken things. Their relationship was just like these ruins. Without looking at Jacob, Samuel said, "The first job is to clean this place. It starts tomorrow." With that, he left. Jacob stood alone in the dark, empty garage. Before him lay a monumental challenge, not just to clean this garage, but an impossible quest to find his father's trust and their lost relationship from within these ruins. But for the first time in many months, he felt he had.
Work began in Ben's garage. The first few days were spent in nothing but silence and hard labor. No words were exchanged between them. Samuel would arrive in the morning, write a list of the day's tasks on a broken blackboard, and then leave. In the evening, after finishing his work at the construction site, Jacob would come and work according to the list, cleaning the junk, trying to restore the rusted tools by scrubbing them, repairing the broken window. He did it all alone. Samuel would come in the evening, but he didn't work with Jacob. He would sit on a stool in a corner, observing Jacob's every move with a sharp eye. There was no sympathy in his gaze, only the harsh evaluation of a craftsman. At Jacob's slightest mistake, he would correct him in a stern voice. "Not that way, hold it like this," or "use more force." Without a word in reply, Jacob would silently follow the instructions. Slowly, the garage began to take the shape of a workshop. The broken pews from the church were brought in. They were heavy, old benches of oak, their carvings worn away by time, the wood infested with termites. Samuel stood before one of the benches and examined its wounds for a long time. For the first time in many months, that old craftsman's light sparked in his eyes again. Their work dynamic changed. Now Samuel didn't just give instructions, he started working himself. He showed Jacob how to strip the old varnish, how to carefully remove the rot from within the wood. Jacob watched in amazement as his father's tired old hands moved over the wood with incredible skill. The silence between them still remained, but now it was filled with the sounds of work. The scrape of the saw, the rhythmic strike of the hammer, the continuous rasp of sandpaper on wood. These were their language. One evening, Samuel was trying to remove a heavy oak leg from a pew. Due to his age, he couldn't muster enough strength. He was trying with gritted teeth, but the leg wouldn't budge an inch. Jacob was watching from a distance. He knew Samuel wasn't the kind of man to ask for help. So, without saying a word, he stepped forward. "I'll hold it, Dad," he said in a low voice. Samuel was startled to hear the word Dad. He had heard that word after a very long time. He said nothing, just made room. Father and son applied force together.
Their shoulders touched, their breaths synchronized. Finally, with a sharp creak, the leg came loose. They were both panting. For a moment, their eyes met. In that gaze, there was no accusation or forgiveness, only the silent understanding of having completed a difficult task together. Another day, while working with a chisel, Jacob carelessly cut his hand. Even as blood started to flow, he tried to hide it from Samuel, pressing the wound with an old rag. But it did not escape Samuel's notice. He stopped his work and got up. A few moments later, he returned with a first aid box. He took Jacob's hand in his own. Without a word, he meticulously cleaned the wound and tied a bandage around it. His touch was rough, but his actions held a deep concentration. It felt to Jacob as if his father had touched him after many years. A wave of sobs was rising inside him, but he held it back. After finishing, Samuel said, "Be careful from tomorrow." His voice was as stern as ever, but Jacob felt that behind this harshness there was a hint of concern. That night, before closing the workshop, Jacob saw a pair of new leather gloves placed at his workstation. He knew who.
A month went by. Ben's damp, dark garage was no longer a pile of junk. It had transformed into a living workshop. The air now held the fresh scent of wood, the faint aroma of varnish, and the fragrance of hard work. The broken church pews were no longer neglected wooden frames. Under Samuel's skilled hands and Jacob's tireless labor, they were slowly regaining their former glory. Samuel no longer just gave Jacob instructions, he taught him how to recognize the grain of the wood, which type of sandpaper to use for which wood, how to join two pieces of wood perfectly. He began to impart all this small but invaluable knowledge to his son. Jacob learned like an attentive student. He was beginning to understand that this wasn't just a job, it was an art. Every touch of his father's hand held decades of experience and a deep love for wood. The ice in their relationship had also begun to melt. One day, while restoring a complex old design on a pew, Samuel mused to himself, "My father used to love this design." He would say that the true beauty of wood lies in its complexity. Jacob stopped working and asked, "Was Grandpa a better craftsman than you?" Samuel smiled faintly. It was the first time Jacob had seen him smile in a long time. He was a craftsman of nature. He didn't command the wood, he listened to it. This was the first time they had spoken about something other than work. That evening, the workshop was no longer just a workplace. It had become a silent stage for reminiscence. Finally, the day came. The final coat of varnish was applied to the last pew. The polished bodies of the oak pews gleamed in the dim light of the garage. They were no longer broken pieces of furniture. They were reborn works of art. Ben arrived with his old pickup truck. Father and son carefully loaded the pews onto the truck. When they arrived in front of the church, Father John came out with a smile. But after the pews were unloaded, his smile turned to astonishment. He ran a hand over the smooth surface of a pew. His eyes lit up. "These haven't just been repaired, Samuel. It's as if they've been given a new life. Unbelievable." He looked at Jacob and said, "Your father has magic in his hands, and you have strength and dedication in yours. The two of you have done an extraordinary job." This was the first time Jacob had received such sincere praise for his work from anyone. A strange feeling of warmth filled him. It was 1,000 times more valuable than the hollow excitement of winning quick money. Father John handed Samuel an envelope. "This is a small gift from the church for both of you." No one spoke on the way back to the workshop. Upon arriving at the garage, Samuel opened the envelope. Inside was some cash. The amount wasn't large, but it was honestly earned. Without a word, Samuel counted the money, then separated exactly half of it and held it out to Jacob. Jacob was stunned. He couldn't raise his hand. "No, Dad, this is yours. I was just—" Samuel cut him off. His voice was calm but firm. "Half of this is yours, Jacob. You weren't just my helper, Jacob. You were my partner in this work." Partner.
That one word washed away all the pain, guilt, and shame that had accumulated in Jacob's chest. His father was beginning to trust him again. Tears welled up in his eyes. Without a word, he took the money with a trembling hand. That evening, the two of them sat side by side on two old chairs outside the workshop. The sun was setting. No words were spoken between them, but this silence was comfortable.
The church pews were just the beginning. After Father John's heartfelt praise, word of their work spread through the town. Small jobs started to come in. Mrs. Harrison's old rocking chair, which her grandmother had used, had a broken leg. Samuel and Jacob repaired it so seamlessly that it was difficult to find the break. They built a few new bookshelves for the town library, sturdy, beautiful, and filled with the scent of oak. Every job was an advertisement for their honesty and skill. They weren't earning a lot of money, but what they were earning was respect and trust. Jacob no longer worked at the construction site. He dedicated all his time to the workshop. He was no longer just a helper. He had become an apprentice craftsman. Skill was slowly growing in his hands. He had learned how to understand the soul of the wood, how to speak to the tools. One evening, after finishing work, the two of them were sitting outside the workshop. The air was cool. Samuel had lit his old pipe. After a long silence, Jacob said in a low voice, "Dad, I'm not just sorry for the money." Samuel looked at him. Jacob continued, "I ruined our name, your lifelong honor, Grandpa's legacy. I disrespected all of it. I didn't just lose your money. I lost your trust. There's no forgiveness for that." His voice was choked with tears. Samuel remained silent for a while, puffing on his pipe. Then he said in a calm voice, "A legacy doesn't live on a shop sign or in a bank account, Jacob. A legacy lives in our hands, in our knowledge, and in our honesty. You made a mistake, a very big one, but you didn't run away. You came back and took responsibility for your mistake. You are atoning. That's what matters." He placed a hand on Jacob's shoulder. "What you lost, you are rebuilding, not just with wood, but with your hard work and honesty. I am proud of you." Hearing the word proud from his father's lips, all of Jacob's emotional dams broke. He broke down, crying like a child. Samuel held him. After so many years, the father and son broke down the wall of all their pain and distance and became one. A few months later, one morning, their workshop was now even more organized. The tools were gleaming. The town mayor himself came to their workshop one day. The old community center was being rebuilt, and they were looking for a local craftsman to make all the furniture. Chairs, tables, cabinets. The job was large and prestigious. The mayor said, "Samuel, we all know the reputation of your work, and we've also heard about your son's hard work. We want the two of you to do this job together." A smile of deep satisfaction appeared on Samuel and Jacob's faces. This was the biggest acknowledgement of their resurrection. The final scene of the story. A winter afternoon. A yellow light glows inside the workshop. Light snow is falling outside. Samuel and Jacob are working on a massive dining table for the community center. Both have sandpaper in their hands. Their hands move together, in the same rhythm over the smooth surface of the wood. One hand old, experienced and veined, and the other young, strong and eager to learn. There were no words between them, only the sound of work. This silence was their deepest conversation. A new sign now hangs over the door of Ben's old abandoned garage. Not an expensive sign, but a simple piece of wood, hand-painted by Jacob himself. Miller and Son. They didn't get their old shop back. The luxurious life of Chicago was also gone. But what they had found was far more precious. They had found each other's trust, self-respect, and the joy of creating something together. This was their American legacy. Not a legacy of money or property, but a legacy of honesty, hard work, and a craft passed down from one generation to the next.